Peter,
Hey,
how you doing?
How you doing? What's up? How you doing?
Hanging in there.
Yeah.
Just
Have you had a long day? Long day today?
No, not a long day. So, it's still only 2:00 for me here
I forgot. It's like
on the left coast. So we're just getting started.
right.
I just woke up a couple hours ago. Feels like it's morning. I'm kidding.
Really?
No.
Yeah, I'm sure.
No,
I'm sure your
I
wife
got
is
up.
okay with that. Yeah, right.
I got up at 7, but
Cool.
no, afternoons are. To be honest, I get my second cup of coffee in the afternoon, and
Nice.
then I'm ready to go. So, but I've been thinking about this episode for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Critical race theory. I feel like a lot of our the initial reason for us interacting and starting this was because of issues surrounding race and the challenges we face in our culture now. So I thought this book has been helpful in getting us kind of the postmodern background behind our current racial tension. But this is really where it climaxes for me. And there's several other books that I've been reading. Fault Lines from Vodi Bakum just came out, which is excellent and really ties it to the church. We read early on, Color of Compromise and by Jemar Tisby and critiqued that. I think if anything, he's become more entrenched in his view, and we've become probably more critical of that book and his views since then. So I don't know. What do you think? What do you think about this episode?
Yeah, I think you and I, we connected about a month after George Floyd. I think you and I were both affected by that, but in different ways. And you and I kind of started reading up on some stuff. We didn't really, I would say that we were both somewhat new to the game on how to identify some of these what's going on. But we weren't necessarily satisfied with the answers. A lot of the answers that we were hearing, but we were still, I would say, kind of wondering on where to land. And I think after a lot of discussions, especially the one with Monique that our listeners can look at for, a few weeks ago, some other
it's been a lot more than a few weeks now.
Yeah. Well, that's true. Yeah. I guess 2 months ago. Right. Yeah. So, I mean, a lot, and we've had quite a few other guests as well, and just our own dialogue. And I think where the church is going and how the church has been more and more divided about these issues, there's something going on that is ungospel-like, I would say. But I'm very careful on, me. I try to listen first and then judge later. But I do think this chapter does a really good job that we're going to look at on explaining where critical race theory really comes from as a philosophy, because I think it's important that our listeners understand how they're so boggled down, because it could seem very just unnuanced, or it could seem very confusing. It could seem very kind of daunting, especially when you're a white cis male or cis female, whatever that's supposed to mean, and that you're kind of having some problems with maybe your Black brother or sisters, how they're dealing with race, and especially stuff with Black Lives Matter. Maybe it's at your church where they're telling you to confess your white privilege. You're not sure where or how this sounds wrong, but you're kind of going along with it. But you're like where we were, not sure how to address it. So I'm hoping this chapter is going to do a very good job telling you where this philosophy has come from, where it came from, why it is what it is, why it does what it does, and why it actually does want to silence a lot of people's voice so that it can put things in categories to leave you either voiceless or to confess and be on their side. So it's very evangelical in that way, the kind of like you have to be converted. And if you do, this is how you can be kind of on our side as witnesses. And if you're not for us, you're against us.
It's how you can receive your atonement. Right. It's perpetual atonement.
Sure.
That you're after. But I would highlight, you mentioned our interview with Monique Duson, which was, it still remains, I think, our most popular episode and the best received, most views on YouTube, the most views on Facebook. So we really appreciated that interview with her, and it just lays some of the groundwork for this discussion we're going to have, and I'll put that in a link to that in the notes if you're listening on Apple podcast, or if you're following on YouTube. But anyways, I would encourage you to follow her and their podcast. All the Things, I think, is what it's called. All the Things podcast with her and Krista Bontrager. Really good stuff. Yeah. But let's jump in, if you don't mind. I mean, we can jump into the book. Oh, you know what? I'll just highlight as well. If you are on Apple iTunes, or if you're following along some other, whether it's Spotify or something, or I guess even Amazon, we're on several different platforms. But whatever you're on, we would love to have a review. Subscribe. If you're on YouTube, hit the like button. Let us know what you think. Send some, feedback or comments. All of that just helps with, how the social media algorithms. It's all based on just people interacting and engaging with what they're watching. So it's helpful when you do something like that to us. We're not asking you to buy our products because we're not selling anything. But if you can do that, that would be a great help to us, and we can let more people know about this stuff. So, do you want to kick us off with
Sure.
the book now?
Yeah, let's do it. So as we've been doing, we're just going to do like a book review. So it starts with basically saying that critical race theory at its root is an American phenomenon. So even though the United Kingdom and it's an American phenomenon more so than a European phenomenon, really started here. And CRT, we're just going to call it CRT for short, really holds that race is a social construct that was created to maintain white privilege and white supremacy. So that's how CRT looks at race. That's why race was basically invented. And there is some, that's a pretty somewhat historically accurate statement. I mean, when you look at the Bible, for example, written thousands of years ago, they didn't really put people into categories of white and brown and stuff like that. And they state that the concept of race was not consistently connected to heritability in Europe until about the 16th century. So you didn't really see a lot of people talking about racial backgrounds until around 1600s or 16th century, excuse me. And and when that came, that's where you started seeing people use that as a justification for the atrocities of European colonialism. And then, of course, the Atlantic slave trade. And then, most importantly, you start seeing natural scholarships kind of starting to natural sciences, although they had neither separated clearly into the disciplines we would now call anthropology, sociology, biology. In other words, you started seeing that those forms of scholarship in what you would call it, those types of things. So those are the 3 points that they say. And in the beginning, Lindsay and Pluckrose state that, that it came into existence really around after this Atlantic slave trade, and where theorists today would call the scientific origins of racism, or the socially constructive racists. That's where they start to come into existence. That we start seeing people based on their skin color. So that's what gave a lot of people justification to enslave blacks, and not just blacks, but also whites were also enslaved. People often forget that. Right. A huge amount of whites were enslaved in the Moroccan slave trade. It was used basically throughout the world. And so let's fast forward, where we started seeing Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, Winthrop Jordan. They started really exposing a lot of racism and the ideologies where it comes from. You and I would agree with all of their critiques. Martin Luther King as well, where discrimination, it really fought on the grounds of that, discriminating somebody based on their skin color should be illegal. You and I would 100% agree on that we should not judge anybody based on their skin color. But where it started coming in the 1970s, the word critical started coming in. Because as much as the study of law basically won a lot of victories. They wanted to see where racism was a lot less, clearly less demonstrable. And so they started defining racism very differently. No longer as judging somebody based on their skin color, but they started understanding that they started taking a very different presupposition on addressing these issues. And they state that there's 2 points. Number one, the materialist approach, as well as the postmodern approach. Now, the materialist approach is going to look at economic, legal, political, how those affect racial minorities. And the main point, such as the late Derek Bell, who is a materialist, he would be very much interested in this, quote, interest convergence. And what that just means is that white people are only wanting to pass legal laws, like as anti-discrimination laws, mainly because it was in their interest to do so. So he didn't actually believe that white people really cared. He kind of read into that people really cared about the civil rights mainly because it was just like in their personal interest. And critical race theory started to become much more liberal, so in its theory, and it started to actually converge with more like Black Panther, Black nationalism. The materialistic approach actually believed in segregation. In today's context, the leave out loud that, say, for example, Jemar is really a part of, we should just leave out loud and kind of segregate. And the main reason for that,
leave loud. No,
leave
out
loud. Thank you. Leave out loud.
You're right. Yeah, I want to talk about that later, but go ahead.
Yeah. And so the materialist approach is going to look at all the imbalances. That's all they're concerned about. So anywhere that you see imbalance, that proves racism. So if you see too many Black people in prison, racism. If you see, and some of it was definitely spot on, like the disparities in maybe some of the housing, redlining, for example. But they would continue that even today, where there doesn't seem to be proof for racism. They would still say if there is economic disparity in a particular group, a materialist would say it's because of the racial view, or racism's kind of underlining it. Now, the postmodernism, and jump in if you want, I'll just summarize this last point. Postmodernism is going to really look at microaggressions, hate speech, safe spaces, cultural appropriation, the IAP tests, or the implicit association test, media representation, and they're going to be looking at whiteness. And so here they want to see how your white theory is basically constructing your language. So as we've talked about before, because I'm a white male, there's a blurring of the boundaries per se. In other words, because of my position, they would call that positionality. Based on my position within society determines my group identity, which dictates how I understand the world. So because I'm a white straight male, I'm based on my position, I can never understand somebody that's over here who's a Black trans or who's a Black female because of my position. So postmodernism would try to blur the boundary, dictate how you can't understand this person, therefore you should listen. So that's standpoint theory. So whenever people say, hey, why don't you just, because of your white privilege, stand back and listen, that's actually standpoint theory. So you should sit back, listen to what they have to say based on that particular premise.
Is that suggesting?
I'm going to stop there. Yeah.
It's their standpoint. It's their standpoint that you need to pay attention to. Right? Absolutely.
Which is pure postmodernism. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So what I'd like to do, you did a great job summarizing the first, several pages of the chapter. So I just want to go back and highlight a few of the things that I, appreciated about that section. And then I'll turn it back over to you to keep summarizing from where you left off, or chime in however you want.
Yeah. Please.
You mentioned the idea of the Bible, how they reference the Bible, not really mentioning the skin color of someone, even though it does have tribalism and it has the ideas associated with sort of finding your identity in your ethnicity or who you are. And actually Paul denounces that, right? He's saying like that because of Christ, I consider all of that stuff rubbish in comparison. He's not saying I hate my heritage. I don't want to have anything to do with my Jewish, heritage, but he was saying that it's rubbish in comparison to Christ, because in Christ, we have everything, right? We have everything we need for life and godliness, and for the community that God is building and and moving us towards. So the goal of our faith is to have that environment where there isn't conflict, where there isn't trials and tension. But what we're getting from this theory really is the opposite. Going back to the subtitle of the chapter, right? Ending racism by seeing it everywhere. Right. As if that is a wise strategy, right? Like you want to get rid of it. So let's just make sure we point every possible episode, which is every episode, right? It's not a matter of whether there was racism involved, but what kind of racism was involved. That's what the theory is promoting. And to be just logical for a second, which I know is whiteness, right? That's my white privilege speaking right now, because I think that you should be logical in your reasoning. Anyways, like the suggestion of that you're going to get somewhere.
Which by itself is really racist when you think about that. Like,
it's so racist.
Only white people are reasonable. So I was like, I think Klansmen would agree with that premise, just to let you know. So I don't want to unite with Klans people who actually would agree that only white people should be reasonable. Just to let you know. I mean, just to point that out, how racist of a comment that actually is. So
yes,
anyway,
well, just in case.
That's why. Anyway, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
just in case you're not sure what.
Look at that. Yeah. Oh, look at this. Yeah.
What we're talking about. I pulled this up earlier. So this is the white culture. This is according to the African American History Museum page on whiteness. What is whiteness? Rugged individualism, family structure, the nuclear family.
Well, let's read that too. Rugged individualism is self-reliance, independence and autonomy highly valued plus reward. Individuals assumed to be in control of their environment. You get what you deserve. So basically, inner locus of control. Whereas I could say for myself as a clinician, that's actually how people get better when they stop blaming. Okay.
CBT. Yeah.
So do you want to read family structure?
Yeah. So family structure. This is something that defines whiteness. Yeah. The nuclear family, father, mother, 2.3 children in the ideal social unit. Husband is breadwinner and head of household, which is also happens, at least part of that, right? The head of the household happens to be a biblical concept. Breadwinner, I think, is implied in a lot of instances, although we don't have to go there. I'm not suggesting women can't work, but I'm just suggesting the pattern we see in scripture is pretty consistent. Wife is homemaker and subordinate to the husband. Also something you get from Ephesians 5. Children should
Sorry, what would they say? Yeah, go ahead. No, I was just curious. What should they say to all those African countries that have husbands and breadwinner?
Right. No, I mean, they're suffering from white supremacy, obviously. Children should have their own rooms and be independent. Anyway, so we could really go on. Obviously, all of these.
Well, also the other third one, if I could look up, the emphasis on the scientific method. This is really, as we keep focusing in on theory, I was just getting into this healthy debate with a guy the other day, how he was talking about he was talking about queer theory and how, anti-scientific Richard Dawkins was for questioning queer theory. And I kind of pointed out to him, actually, queer theorists don't believe in the scientific method. They're actually adamantly against it, as we pointed out in our last podcast. So critical race theorists like Ibram Kendi, Jemar, Tisby, they're not going to focus on the scientific method. In other words, they don't want objectivity. They don't want rational thinking. They don't want cause and effect relationships. So in other words, you can't measure whether or not you're right or wrong. That really sounds like so keep going. I was just,
we don't have to go through all of this. The whole point was that obviously it's not just a white thing. A lot of these are examples of just good virtues and values that people hold to across ethnic boundaries. I mean, so I don't want to focus on that too much, but it's just an obvious. It isn't just reverse racism; it's racism to associate virtues, or, call them whatever you want. Some of them are vices for sure, but to associate all of them with whiteness is ridiculous.
Yeah. And going on the second point on the postmodern part, just to go back to the book, I mean, the clear job of the critical race theory maintains a commitment to the role of the discourse in constructing social reality and addressing issues of apparently infinite complexity, but it does not usually despair of conveying meaning through clear language. In other words, so that's the clear job. In other words, they want to destroy all universal truths, so therefore see the world as infinite complex, multivaried, and no universal claim, but also destroy the power of language, especially when it comes to binaries. So all binaries are wrong except for the binary of oppressor versus oppressed. But their tenets, the tenets of critical race theory, CRT, is that racism is ordinary, as you said earlier, not aberrational. That's everyday experience of all people. So going back on Tisby, when you look at his book on color compromise, the very first premise, the very first chapter, racism is everywhere. Racism has not died, but it's adapted. I think that's right. Isn't that? Yeah, it
hasn't gone away. It's adapted.
Hasn't gone into. Yeah, that's critical CRT, right from the book. The other thing too is that a system of white over color ascendancy serves important purposes, both physical and material, for the dominant group. So in other words, only white people can be racist. Nobody else can be, because we're the dominant group. The third part is the social construction thesis holds that race and races are products of social thought and relations. In other words, it's opposition to the idea of racial difference as innate. So in other words, they want to destroy the individual. They actually want to kind of like somewhat, not like Buddhism, not like that at all, but they actually do not believe in the sovereignty of the individual. You are purely defined by your group. And when we start talking about intersectionality, it's no I, it's us in that way. So it's extremely, so that's where standpoint theory is so powerful, because you're not only, if you're arguing with a black man, you're not just arguing with your black friend, you are arguing against us, right? All of us. So that's, which is really what you see with standpoint theory. And so it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. So you're not just talking to this one person who may disagree with you, like, Brad and Bill. Brad is, when he's arguing with Bill, who's a black man at the coffee shop, Brad's arguing with all black people, according to CRT, when you disagree. Yeah.
Well,
well,
I mean, that you mentioned earlier too, Derek Bell and his involvement. One of the things that they point out in the book on page 115 is the idea that there has not really been any progress, and obviously that's what you were just saying. From a lot of people say, like, I'm not reading the critical race theorists. I'm not reading, the academic, scholarly books. I'm just talking to my friends. I'm listening. I'm trying to be compassionate. I'm trying to understand their story, and I'm trying to apply it. Well, who are they reading? At some point, you get back to where you see the roots of it in cultural Marxism and in socialism and in these theories, this postmodern theory. So that's why we're going back and saying, look, yes, we said already that Jemar Tisby says that we haven't made progress. We just adapted. Racism hasn't gone away. It's just adapted to to become effective in various generations. But that's not unique to him. That's not his theory. He didn't come up with that.
No.
And if someone tells you that, well, you're not listening to my story. Again, that's coming from a postmodern idea that narrative is actually better than evidence, right? Or it serves as evidence, and it's not just alongside the evidence, but it's better, it's superior to the empirical data that you can study. And by the way, just as we said, empirical data itself is just a problem of whiteness, right? I mean, it's something that we need to depend upon for our logical reason. But it's just so all I'm saying is we go back to it. I want to point out where there is consistencies, because you can then say, look, you don't have to have read Derek Bell to be understanding what Derek Bell taught through Jemar Tisby. Like Jemar Tisby is teaching Derek Bell.
Yeah. Well, and that's a good segue into in the middle of the book in 121. Thank you for that's a really good observation, because what he says, the spread of CRT, how is it spread? And I love this chapter in 121 where he says, because I think everyone can, when they hear this when they hear this one little paragraph, everyone, if you've been watching the Super Bowl, or if you've just turned on the television, or if you've just watching your news, you know exactly what I'm talking about here. And they do such a good job. So CRT doesn't consider it racist. We are told that racism is embedded in culture and that we cannot escape it. So presidential election, systemic racism, Joe Biden. So let me keep going. So we hear that white people are inherently racist. We are told that racism is, quote, prejudice plus power. Therefore, only white people can be racist. We are informed that only people of color can talk about racism, that white people need to just listen, and that they don't have the, quote, racial stamina to engage it. We hear that not seeing people in terms of their race, being colorblind, is in fact racist, and an attempt to ignore the pervasive racism that dominates society. So that's how they see it, because you're ignoring the domination. They see it as a diversion, and you're just perpetuating white privilege.
Right.
So it's either you completely submit, and I don't know if you have Robin DiAngelo's little chart, that would be really good to show our audience, or you are part of the problem. So it's that us versus them. It's very, very religious. I mean, it seeps with religion, and I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah.
But, I just wanted to go
I'll search for the Robin DiAngelo's chart in a second, but the other thing I wanted to say, and then maybe you can start summarizing some more of the book, but they bring up the idea that, and this is important, I think, for us to say, because the assumption is that if you're pushing back on this, it's because of your right? Because of your racism. You're trying to deny, because you want to retain your power. You're denying the existence of racism, at least in your own actions. And I just, I think the idea that there is a possibility for racism to exist in a particular event or action that takes place. The question is not, is the possibility of racism there, but why do you suggest it is? Don't assume that it is. To make the assumption itself is sinful, right? It's showing partiality to someone because of the skin color. To assume that I'm being racist is racist. It's showing partiality. So you have to show me why I'm being racist in a particular act. What am I doing? And I'm not saying it needs to be some hardcore evidence that you could prove in a court trial. I'm just saying, point out to me why it is that you think. Don't tell me, well, you have implicit bias, and therefore that must have affected the way you interacted right now. Yeah. To me, that is sinful. So you need to first of all say, come away from the assumptions you're making that maybe others have taught you how to make, and begin to look at the evidence objectively. And then if there is still a problem that I need to address, I can address it. But if you come at me hot with this, like, you're racist and it's showing all over, because of what? Tell me what I did to offend you, and I will apologize if it's needed.
Well, it's begging the question. And also, as we've talked before, it's, the Freudian therapist, I know I probably have used that joke before, Freudian therapy, early Freud, where the guy comes in and he says, "Hey, Dr. Freud, I had a dream last night about making love to Angelina Jolie." And the Freudian therapist says, "You just want to sleep with your mother." And he says, no, actually, Angelina Jolie doesn't look like my mother. And the Freudian therapist says, "Aha, reaction formation. You definitely want to sleep with your mother." It's just like your head is spinning. It's just like, it doesn't matter where I go. So it's just, in logic, it's just the same thing. We call it begging the question. And, this is, now if I could kind of pick on Christians a little bit in the church. Like, I wonder if the Reformed Church has been really dominated by, I don't want to get too diverge too much on this, but Christians can actually do the same thing with the Bible. You should believe the Bible, therefore, because the Bible says it's true. It's not a very good argument, right? Now, that's not the same thing per se, but begging the question should start with something that proves to the evidence. And that's a different diversion for a different day. But I mean, we do have time to talk about intersectionality. I don't know if you wanted me to, or you could kind of slow down and that's a lot there.
I'm okay slowing down. I'm not in a rush. Are you in a rush
no, it was 30 minutes, and we could also just kind of, but I think what we could intersectionality, just reviewing it again by Kimberly Crenshaw. She wants to, she really attacked the liberalism and and
well, hey, hang on, Peter, before you jump into, because I'm fine with that. Intersectionality is totally connected to critical race theory. I don't mind talking about it right now, but I did want to go back to, I never did finish. Please. I went off on my little tangent and never came back.
Let's do that. Let's talk about your tangent. Yeah.
My point was that, we should acknowledge that racism is a potential. And he mentions that, right? There is valuable work in addressing measurable imbalances in the political, legal, and economic realms by comparing, for instance, funding for schools in majority white and black areas, differences in sentencing of black and white offenders, disparities in housing and lending in black and white communities. And you mentioned those, you said redlining, you talked about the disparities, right? Sure. Differences in representation of black and white people in high prestige jobs with a view to learning why these disparities have come about. Like, if we're going to look at those disparities and then begin to address them based on the evidence, and then try to find out, okay, well, if there is some racial tension that's making this worse than it should, or that's causing this kind of disparity, well, then let's begin to reprimand that, or let's start to criminalize that activity, which is what has happened, right? You cannot have redlining is not allowed anymore now. So these things have happened historically, and that's part of what the battle for civil rights was all about, right? I mean, it was getting rid of Jim Crow laws, and those things have been done away with. Now, if you're suggesting that there's still racism, what the book is advocating for is to say, well, let's look at the differences, let's compare those differences, and let's find out what it is that's causing them. Because there could be competing theories here. And it's not just, you shouldn't just assume it's because of racism that there are disparities in the economic, world or in housing communities. And I mean, there's so many factors. In fact, one of the things that Thomas Sowell oftentimes talks about is that the welfare state is part of the reason why we've perpetuated the problems within poor communities, right? Is because we've actually entrenched them in poverty all the more, and we've incentivized their poverty so that you don't want to get married. You don't want to have a 2-parent home. You want to have a single family because you get more money from the government in that case. You don't want to go get and there's a lot of factors I know, but we are incentivizing not working, and we're incentivizing remaining single, both ultimately detrimental to the mental and the physical and emotional health of an individual. So it is perpetuating the problem that it starts. So anyways, I don't want to just get off on welfare state, but that's the idea is we've got competing theories, and we need to analyze which one is actually causing the problem here.
Well, if I could also ask this, if we went to a company and we said, we need to do an IRS audit, and they said, no, we don't believe in any measurable goals, and we're not cheating because we've said that we're not cheating. And the fact that you're trying to bring measurable goals and you're trying to look at our audits just prove the fact that you think that we're a bad company. Would we trust that company or not trust that company? Of course we wouldn't. I mean, we wouldn't trust the company mainly because they don't want anything outside, to basically give them any type of accountability. I mean, if a wife thinks that her husband is cheating on her, and she says, "Hey, I need to look at your phone," and he screams at her and he says, "How dare you? You should disobey my authority and walks out? Is she going to increase her trust? My point is that I think a movement that basically says that any objectivity or any measurable goal, why does racism always have to exist for you? Why can't you achieve a type of measurement of success? Because the minute you do, you have already basically made a boundary for yourself on what you're looking for, and you're immediately accountable. And I believe that all corruption comes from the lack of accountability. All of it, whether it's a church that is Ravi Zacharias that didn't have any, or if it's a movement that really looks at anybody that wants to keep me accountable needs to leave, that's a corrupt movement. That's, it doesn't matter who it is. It's just like the minute a organization or a church or a leader says you have no right to keep me accountable, is corrupt to the core. Yeah. And that's what I think we really need to understand about this. And not only that, but when Thomas Sowell talks about the race baiters. Who are the race baiters? I mean, you look at the amount of profit that Ibram Kendi is getting. Jemar is about to get all this. There's a lot of profit to be made. Robin DiAngelo, what, $40,000 to speak for 30 minutes?
She has a 7-figure income.
7 figures. Yeah. I mean, shoot. I used to joke in seminary, hey, I think you and I probably made those jokes a few times. Like, maybe we should just be name it and claim it preachers, and then we can make a lot more money than Presbyterian preachers. You make a lot more money. And I don't want to see, that's the thing. I don't want to read the intentions of people, because that's exactly what this movement is doing. I want to just look at the evidence. And the evidence actually says that if you don't want accountability, 9 times out of 10, there's because something seriously corrupt is going on. So I do think that's, because that's what measurement actually does. But,
Well, so I don't know where you are on the chapter, but on 117 at the very end of the first paragraph, it says, by looking at multiple systems of power and privilege and situating experience as a source of knowledge within them, they moved away from materialist analysis and towards the postmodern. And you brought that out earlier. Yeah. But going back to that experience-based knowledge really leads to the Leave Loud, #Leave Loud movement.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that. We could wait on intersectionality on a different day. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's find. So the idea of the Leave Loud movement has been started by the Witness podcast, which
do you want to summarize that? Because I actually don't know a lot about it. I just know little hashtags, but you want to go ahead.
Well, sure. All I know is that they're highlighting different stories from Black people who have left a predominantly white setting, usually within, I think most of them are within the church. I listened to Jemar Tisby's story because I was there for part of that in Mississippi. So I was familiar with some of it, but the suggestion is that at some point a Black person who's in that predominantly white setting is either going to blow out, burn out, or sell out. Those are the options he gives. And then he goes on to basically encourage people in those environments to just leave loud, #Leave Loud, and promote your story so that we can just blow this whole scenario up. And I don't, again, what are the intentions behind this? I think the intentions, if I'm being optimistic, are that we need to be able to be real with our story, and we should not be ashamed or afraid of saying things because of the backlash we could get for telling that story. And so I think what Jemar would say is he has every right to tell his story. It's his story. And if you want to threaten him with something, well, then, I'm going to leave loud. I'm going to I'm going to leave very boldly and proudly. And you can take it wherever you want. Basically, here's my version of the story. And there's something to be said for having your own, a willingness to defend yourself in that way. But, the idea that you can only have those 3 situations, the blowout, burnout, or sellout, is to suggest that racial reconciliation is not possible. That you cannot have a scenario where a Black person in a predominantly white setting is ever going to be healthy. And I would say that's that's wrong. I mean, you look at, there are several examples that you could look at, Bodhi Baucham being one of them, who has made that work in a predominantly white church. In fact, he intentionally did that, became the pastor of a predominantly white church. And he proves the opposite of that statement that Jemar made. So, but all this to say that the Leave Loud movement is emphasizing above all else that I have a story, and that story is so powerful and impactful that if I just share it, then I'm pushing back against racism, right? That's the work of the anti-racist, is to share your story boldly. Not everyone's story, like my story doesn't matter. Your story doesn't matter, Peter. But if you have the right skin color and you have the right ideology so that you're pushing back against white supremacy, then you have a place at the table to leave loud. And if I could respond.
Go ahead.
Let me say one more thing real quick, and then I'll throw you. But Bodhi Baucham calls that ethnic Gnosticism. He's got a whole chapter on where he basically says this is a secret knowledge that you have to have, and your skin color gives you that secret knowledge because you've had that experience, and no one else can speak against it or into it. You just have to be able to share that story. And he quotes Romans 3 in opposition to that, and just suggesting that it's that we're all corrupt. We've all been deceived by our sinfulness. And again, to one more thing to point out in the book because we're reading, it's an atheist, right? Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay are unashamedly atheists. And they would just lump in like total depravity, the idea that sin is infected all of us. They would just lump all of that in with the mythology of white supremacy being infecting everything about Americans, right? So, you can push back on both sides here, but the idea that narrative is all defining is problematic, not only for logic and for a pursuit of truth, but it's also problematic for Scripture from a biblical standpoint.
Well, and I think it's probably good that we end on that too. I mean, I want to end on, let's end on the gospel. What you just said too. I mean, what is, especially when you think about burnout, blowout or sellout, what Jemar just basically did right there is that he has just committed the serious Galatian heresy. I mean, that's heresy. That's the denial of the gospel. Number one, our stories and his stories and your stories, they actually don't matter. In the context of church, it's Jesus Christ's story that matters, and it's the gospel that matters. And that supersedes all stories. And if anybody tries to put their story above the gospel of Jesus Christ, they're a false teacher, plain and simple. I mean, so that's it doesn't matter what your color is. The minute you put your story above the gospel, which is the unifying message of the cross for all people. And Jemar actually explicitly says in in an article a little while ago that he was fighting for basically the Lord's Supper only being with other Black people. That is the Galatian heresy. That's an outright denial of the gospel of Jesus Christ. If I am looking at you and I'm saying you can't come to this table based on your skin color, he is doing the same thing that white Klansmen did in the 1940s against Blacks, and he is no better. Jemar Tisby, if he were white in the 1800s, he would have owned slaves, and he would have been a Klansman. He is no better. He really is. And that's why I'm so against what he has to say, is because it's not about white versus Black, or racism is a human problem. It's not a white problem. It is my problem. It's my heart problem. And until I realize that I have a capability of murdering my brother and I need the cross just as much as everyone does, I'm lost. And it's not my story. It's his story. And, when we're preaching, we need to get the heck out of the way. And he is the one that redeems us, not, we can't redeem ourselves. And I think, Bachman's right. It's a Gnostic heresy. We keep going back to that this is a false gospel that cannot save any of us from our sin. There's so much, it's a new caste system, that puts people in categories. It's the reversal of everything that we've known to be so evil in the racist wars, and it's bringing it all back again. And if what we need more than anything is it's not the terrible means to get back into categories, but to get back to the unifying message of the cross, and that's just, I love what you said. And I think we need to keep encouraging our listeners, go to the Bible, go to the scripture, run to Christ, because this isn't where you're going to find him. But we also want to help our listeners too. This is where a lot of it really comes from. And there's a lot of stuff in here, but they don't have anyway. Yeah, that's all I have to say.
Well, yeah, I that's a good place to end. I would say, as an aside, the stories that are being told right now, because they are so ubiquitous, like literally they're all over the media, they're all over the bookstores. Every bestseller list is about race on the nonfiction category. But it's like the assumptions that people have now just on the street are that police are at war with, like, they are literally hunting down Black people. And there's a PragerU video where they asked three people, I think it was Black people, who they were asking them from an area where there was some crime. And they said, how many Black people do you think, unarmed Black people, were shot by cops in 2019, which is the last year we have data, the full data for? And all of them said something like 1,000, 1,200, 1,400.
Yeah, right.
And then they asked him, how many white people do you think were shot? And they said 9, 12, 14. And then they shared with them the data, and they said, no, it's actually 19 white unarmed people were shot by cops in 2019, and only 9 Black people were shot by unarmed Black people were shot. So it's less, and it's not even anywhere near the numbers that you're throwing out there. So the idea that these stories, these narratives, are not powerful or reaching some sort of they're affecting the psyche of our nation right now. We've got to be aware of the promotion of this lie, which is what it is. It's absolute. It's you're saying it's heresy with regard to the gospel, right? But it's just a lie with regard to society, right? Yeah. It's just false information. So we've got to push back against it from both angles, which is what we're trying to do, right? That's why we're using this book to say, like, you don't have to be a Christian to push back on this stuff. But if you're a Christian, you absolutely should be pushing back on it from multiple angles now. So I agree with you. I think that was a good way to end with the gospel. Yeah. We had some good comments from Ben. Thank you for sharing. He was active Ben and
Benjamin. It sounds like a Halo name. Yeah, that's awesome.
Benjamin.
Yeah.
All right, man. All right. Well, we had I don't know about what you think, but we were trying to keep our episodes shorter for a while. We were trying to fight to get it into 30 minutes, and we're just not. We're not good at being.
We talk too much. Yeah,
but frankly, I'm over that. Like, I'm tired of trying to be closed in by these rules, these fake rules, right? No one gave us those rules, but ourselves.
We gave it ourselves.
Why are we shaming ourselves with that?
I don't know.
If people want to turn it off after 30 minutes, they're welcome to turn it off after 30 minutes.
Yeah.
All right, man.
All right. Well, hey, this is good.
It's fun.
Good stuff, man. It's so good to see you.
Very good to see you.
Yeah. And I had a good time with Sean. Yeah, we had a good time. Yeah. So
I did not get to see him much at
he said he saw you pass
conference. We passed each other multiple times, but it was kind of a busy time, and I was interacting with a lot of people. But let's definitely pick back up on this chapter. I want to hit intersectionality.
That sounds good.
And we might be able to wrap up what we were talking about with critical race theory. But frankly, this is probably going to be a topic that we bring up multiple times on this podcast. As long as it's in the news, it's sort of a relevant topic, and people are interested in it. The episodes that get the most attention that we've done so far have to do with race. So queer theory was also one that seemed to strike a nerve. So, but I mean, anyway, so let's just plan on revisiting this again.
Sounds good. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks, guys.